Hello and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you're having a good day where you're at. And again, thank you for joining us for this CDI Innovation Webinar, where we are going to be talking about day one through go live with AI-powered proactive CDI. We have Josh Amrhein here today that will be presenting. So before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple housekeeping items. There is a handout in your dashboard, so it is in the drop-down if you want to download that and follow along. If you are having any audio issues, also take a look in your audio section of your dashboard. You can check your computer audio, but if not, there are passcodes and the phone number to join through your phone if you need to. We will be providing a certificate of attendance at the end of the webinar, and we also would like your feedback. If you do have a moment after, can you go ahead and complete that survey that will launch immediately following? Again, we'd love your feedback. So if you have any questions during the webinar, we really would like to answer those at the end if we have time. That's also located in the dashboard under questions. So please ask throughout. And then at the end, like I said, if we have time, we'll get to as many as possible. So without further delay, I am going to go ahead and pass it on over to Josh as our presenter today.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. As Lisa mentioned, my name is Josh Amrhein. I'm the manager of our adoption and implementation services here at 3M on the CAPD, or Computer Assisted Provider Documentation team. My background is primarily in health administration, and I come to 3M with about 15 years plus experience across different spectrums of healthcare in both acute adult care as well as pediatric long-term care, and also worked in an outpatient endocrinology practice along with emergency medicine. I have been involved with the CDI Engage 1 implementation team pretty much since the very beginning. So my team primarily works with the customers on their implementation approach, as well as then the optimization and adoption post-implementation. So the presentation today, as Lisa covered, will really go from day one of your implementation through sort of adoption and optimization, and talk a little bit about that. So really, for the objectives of today's presentation, my goal is to give you an overview of the conversational AI and proactive CDI approach, talk about the stakeholders in the strategy development of the implementation, talk about a little bit around the key workflows and the different project phases that we'll come in contact with, as well as the best practices as it relates to our CDI physician engagement. As well as I'll touch base on some of the technology considerations, and then also how to use the data to drive continuous improvement. So if we think of conversational AI and the platform around that, it really starts with speech recognition, as well as real-time NLU. NLU, for those that are not aware, means natural language understanding. So that really is the brain behind the reasoning of the documentation to produce either those physician nudges, or as well as producing clinical evidence sheets in the CDI workflow within 360 Encompass or CDI Collaborate. I'll talk a little bit further about those. Obviously, from a clinical intelligence perspective, what we really want to do is we want to build out the clinical understanding for your providers. It's no longer about just doing the text matching, provider said heart failure, we're going to show the heart failure nudge. We really want to build out the clinical understanding and intelligence behind what is the overarching sort of clinical evidence for that heart failure, and what is really contained within that encounter that drives that heart failure nudge to your provider. From an NLU perspective, it's also about the deep learning and having that contextual awareness. So NLU is always an ongoing process. It's learning as your providers are doing their documentation, so that over time it strengthens. If we think of really the conversational AI, it starts at the very beginning with the clinical documentation. That can be through speech recognition, as I mentioned, but that doesn't mean that it's only speech recognition. Your providers could be just typists They could be using any of the smart technologies with the different EMR platforms that are out there. It's basically any modality to get that text within the document, it'll be captured at that time. We're then taking that information and creating that sort of clinical oversight to that document and then looking to drive action off of that. So looking at this next slide, we're saying here that the patient has congestive heart failure, a history of diabetes. We're mentioning some additional medications around sort of that clinical concept. We're creating that document insight, and then we're telling the provider at the end of the day, specify the type and acuity. So looking at sort of the conversational AI perspective, we're taking into consideration the documentation of heart failure, the documentation of hypertension, that the patient's on lisinopril. We're not only looking at the fact of saying that this patient has heart failure, document the type and acuity. We're looking at the really behind the clinical evidence that's really driving that nudge to the provider. So if we think of the overarching sort of workflow and impact that we're looking here, it starts at the very beginning with the physician, but it doesn't mean that it ends with the physician. From the physician provider's aspect, they're able to stay in the electronic medical record. From a CDI Engage 1 perspective, the dependency of the technology is Fluency Direct. That can sit on top of your electronic health record. That is going to serve the purpose to show the nudges for specificity to the provider. That doesn't mean that your provider needs to leave the electronic medical record to see the nudges being displayed. It will sit on top of, so that it is really able to show the provider while they're in the documentation the specificity that's required. We are not here to diagnose for providers the same way the CDI programs do not diagnose from a query perspective. We do not diagnose from a nudge perspective. We are doing exactly that. We're nudging the providers for the specificity that's required. It is not a hard stop technology, so the provider still needs to use their clinical judgment as to what may be required from the specificity perspective. In addition to the functionality, we also have the capabilities of delivering CDI queries to the provider. So that means that it can continue to go to the provider in your current mechanism or through the EHR functionality, or you do have the ability with CDI Engage 1 to bring it sort of on the front end to the provider real time through sort of the Fluency Direct control bar or the CAPD ribbon. And again, CAPD, computer assisted provider documentation. So from the provider perspective, they're really starting, obviously, the documentation, and that is what is going to trigger those nudges. From the CDI perspective, the question has always been from the CDI standpoint, can I see really what the provider did with that nudge, or how did they interact from that? So from the CDI standpoint, whether they're using 360 Encompass or CDI Collaborate, they're going to have the capability to see that nudge activity. So they're going to be able to see, did a provider ignore a nudge? And if so, then they'll be able to send that manual query to the provider. As well as with the introduction of CDI Engage 1, we're really looking to help from a productivity and prioritization perspective from the CDI workflow. So there's multiple configurations as it relates to CDI Engage 1, and from the CDI standpoint, they're going to be able to receive enhanced prioritization from natural language understanding. So that will be using, again, more than just text matching, but we will be using the full clinical concept from a prioritization perspective. As I mentioned, they will be able to see the physician nudge activity, as well as the introduction of evidence sheets. So really from an evidence sheet perspective, and how I explain it to customers or how I explain it to CDI nurses is, and I know this probably still happens, but I go back to envisioning a CDI nurse with a piece of paper and scratch pad and writing down on this date, on this document, the provider started to document this clinical condition, and sort of jotting down as they're going through their workflow how that clinical concept or that condition progressed. So we're really, with the use of evidence sheets, taking that away, that manual effort, and we are producing that real time to the CDIs. And we're saying, okay, in the encounter, we found that there was an ejection fraction identified. We found that there was a BNP level that was greater than 500. We found that the patient was receiving Lasix 20 milligrams IV twice a day. So the CDI nurse is no longer needing to jot that information down. With the use of evidence sheets, we are prioritizing that for the CDI nurses. And I'll get into it a little bit later about how we determine what those evidence sheets are going to look like, but we're not going to throw basically all of our library at them, which is probably sitting around 400 different clinical conditions. We're going to be very pragmatic in what we not only select for the physician as it relates to the nudge, but we're also going to be pragmatic in what we enable for the CDI nurse, because we don't want to cause alert fatigue, whether it be the physician or the CDI nurse. We want both sides of the tool to really help in overall productivity and also from a time perspective. So in this slide, if you think about it, it starts at the physician, it goes to the CDI nurse, and we look for obviously the evolving cycle and the continuous cycle as it relates to the continuum of care. So now looking at the stakeholders and the roles involved within the implementation, that's one question I always get asked is, who do we really need to be involved in the implementation? And it is going to be a team approach. And I can't hit home on that enough, is we need to make sure that it's not siloed, in the sense of we don't want the IT sort of stakeholders making the decisions. We need CDI leadership, we need CDI end users at the table, and most importantly, we need physician oversight. I cannot stress that enough. The successful implementations that we've seen have been those that have had physician oversight, and that can even be a physician champion that's been identified, or it can be a physician that's involved with the CDI team. But going into it with having no physician buy-in, it's just going to open us up for failure. As well as we need, while yes, we are thinking about the CDI standpoint, we need to also involve not coding and revenue cycle, because at the end of the day, this is also going to impact sort of their workflows potentially, and them seeing the output of really getting the specificity needed from the beginning to end. So the strategy development and alignment, if we think about it again, who needs to be involved? So from the customer perspective, a lot of times it does sit with HIM or CDI to really drive the implementation. I will tell you from my experience, how I sort of try to set it up is having the decisions driven by the CDI stakeholders, and then having that float down to the IT team. Normally it's, if we can tell the IT staff, this is what we need to really drive the implementation, but have sort of the decisions made by CDI, it works a little bit better, because obviously this is going to be a CDI, or this is a CDI impacting sort of technology. So from the customer perspective, I expect at the table again to be HIM management, CDI management, physician champions, having your system analyst, if your facility is one that has a CDI system analyst, that is always imperative, and someone that's very useful to have at the table, because they understand your CDI workflows, or maybe they have assisted in building out your CDI workflows, as well as having your EMR, your integration SMEs involved, because there are going to be times where my team or myself may ask of questions, and we don't really know how something stands because that subject matter expert is not readily available. From the 3M perspective, in talking about really CDI Engage 1, your participants will be your engagement manager or your project manager, or both, your implementation consultant, and this is a person that's assigned to the project that's really responsible for doing the configurations of the application, your adoption specialist, and this is the resource that is going to be with you for the life of your contract. So the adoption team, which I oversee, we are there from the beginning to end, and it is an extreme benefit in the sense of we're not switching hands after the implementation is complete. The adoption specialist starts with you at the beginning of the implementation, and then once the implementation team falls out, the adoption specialist remains with you for the life of your contract. So after the implementation, what we do is we work with you to make sure that the technology is being optimized to its fullest potential. And I will tell you, our level of involvement really goes off of your expectation. We can have weekly calls, we can have bi-weekly calls, we can have monthly touch point calls with your leadership team. It is really however much you want to be involved, we want to be involved with you. If our life was not pretty much being probably driven a little bit by COVID right now, my expectation is that we visit you once a quarter. And how much time we spend on site is, again, really up to you. Some customers have us on site just for a day. Other customers have us on site for a week. And if you're a large IDN or a large health system that has multiple facilities and you want us to stop in at multiple facilities during an adoption visit, that is completely fine. But I really try to get on site once a quarter, not only to provide you support from maybe how the technology is being used, but it never ceases to fail that once we get on site, providers unload on us. Everyone thinks it's going hunky-dory, and then we come on site and the providers tell us everything that is wrong, or since we're the vendor, they want to just unleash on us on things that they think need to be fixed. And that is great because that's how we learn what needs to be fixed. So we really want to be able to round with your providers when we do adoption visits, as well as spend time with your CDI team to maybe receive feedback as to their experience as to how the utilization is going from, let's say, a natural language perspective. NLU is not a perfect science. It constantly needs to be tweaked. So if I was to tell you that we're going to get it right 100% of the time, right out the gate for this clinical condition, I would be lying to you. But we constantly need to tweak it and we can change it. So that's the important part here. And as the adoption specialist role, that's the feedback that we are looking for, is what needs to be changed. So we're focusing really on the utilization of the technology, good, bad, and ugly. As well as you will have a business process advisory services consultant that is involved with the implementation. And the BPaaS consultant, again, will be determined through contracting as well as their level of involvement. But for the most part, they're involved for about the first year of the implementation. And they're here to help develop your workflows, as well as they too will do some post-implementation follow-up to make sure that the application from the CDI standpoint is being utilized to its fullest potential. When we start the implementation and we determine the sort of deployment strategy and the alignment, we will go through a discovery session. That happens shortly after the kickoff of the project. Really, we can't go into your implementation until the discovery's happened, because I don't know how to implement to your expectation without having that discovery completed. So when we go into a discovery, what we're really looking for is to have a better understanding of what your current process is. You might already be using some pieces of technology. You might be a net new implementation for 360 Encompass or CDI Collaborate, or you might also still have paper processes that are occurring. So that's where we really want to have a level of understanding of what is your current CDI practice, what is this technology meant to replace, or where is it that this technology is going to intersect. So one of the first things that we always start with is getting a level of understanding of your current query process. Is it something that is still paper? Is it something that you're doing primarily in the electronic medical record? Or is it a hybrid where you're doing some pieces in the electronic medical record, there's other pieces in a CDI application, or you're still tracking them through an Excel spreadsheet because not everything is housed within the electronic medical record. So when you go into the discovery session, we really want to have that level of understanding of what is going on with your queries as it stands today. We also want to walk away from what are your top query conditions, because that's also going to help to drive decisions during the implementation. That is something that we refer back to is when we start to determine what are going to be those nudges for the providers. One of the things my team's first going to ask for is, what are your top query conditions? So we can see where those align in our current library that we have available. And then we want to know, as I mentioned, what is your physician oversight? And these are just sample questions. We go through a much more in-depth discovery. It can last anywhere from about a full day all the way up to about 2.5 days, depending on the parts of the technology that you're going to be implementing or have already implemented, and really what we need to cover. But we really want to know, another sample question is, do you have physician oversight? And if so, what is their level of involvement? Some of the technology aspects of the implementation, we want to know your technology environment. Are you using single sign-on? How is your electronic medical record deployed? Is it through Citrix? Are you hosted by your EMR vendor? Are you currently a customer that uses voice recognition, whether that be through 3M Modal's Fluency Direct, or are you using another application that we can still deploy nudges against, even if they're not using Fluency Direct for voice recognition? So we want to have a better understanding of your overarching technology and deployment strategies. And then the most important part for those that are sort of signing the check for the implementation, the return on investment, and really the impact that it's going to have. So some of the pieces that we are always asked about is, how many nudges display to my provider? Okay, my provider saw this many nudges. How many did they actually react with and add the specificity in? So it's always about what is the technology driving from the provider end. But I always tell customers that this tool from the provider standpoint, yes, while we're trying to get the specificity real time in the documentation, we want to give credit where credit is due as it relates to their natural documentation habits. So we not only capture in our reporting what has been driven from the use of the technology, we're also capturing Dr. Smith. He added the type and acuity of heart failure right off the bat, and nudge didn't display. So that you can go back to your providers and say, you know what, you are doing a good job with this condition, and you have sort of, let's say over time, learned from the application for the specificity that's required. And then as we look at the overarching CDI program, the question always comes down to, what did this have impact to my query volumes? You know, when I work with CDI teams, and the CDI end users, they hear about the physician application and the nudges, and they think it's great, but then it never ceases to fail. They always come back and say, well, if you're going to nudge the provider real time for this needed specificity, what does this do for me from the CDI side? Because I'm always used to sending those queries. It is a very fine line here in how I sort of use the sales pitch to the provider. From the provider end, we always say, hey, if you add the specificity now, it's going to save you time on the back end from having to go answer that query. We obviously want to give them time to care back to their patients. If they would add the specificity there, we hope that saves them time on the back end. But on the flip side, I always tell the CDI, we want to take care of the low-hanging fruit for you. You know, we hear from our customers constantly, my top query conditions is going to be stage of CKD and type and acuity of heart failure, and maybe type and acuity of respiratory failure. Low-hanging fruit, ones that they're banging their head off the wall. But what we hope to see is that maybe the query volumes in themselves are not going to shift, but in the long run, you're going to be able to send more complex queries. Or maybe you're not getting to a patient population right now that you would like to review, but because you don't have to send the low-hanging fruit queries, you're able to focus on sort of this patient population that you haven't been reviewed. Or maybe there's an insurance that you are not getting to that you want to focus on. So from an ROI perspective, I know when people think of return on investment, it always comes down to the dollars, but I think we also have to keep in the back of our mind the qualitative aspect to the technology and where that can also glean some advancement for CDI programs. So from the phase approach of the implementation, if all the stars align, an implementation on average occurs in about 24 weeks. I know that seems long, and we definitely have implementations that go longer, but it does take time, especially once we get into the natural language understanding phase of the implementation. That takes time for that to occur. That review process and that part of the implementation just does not happen overnight. So our typical sort of phases are over 3 sections, let's say. The first one we always start with is going to be the physician-facing end of the tool. And the reason being is because for the most part, we can get that stood up pretty fast. Obviously, there's going to be some technology deployments that need to occur, but this isn't something that needs to take 3 or 4 months, unless, of course, you have a very complex environment that we have to deploy in. But for the most part, we can get this stood up in about 60 days. And from the physician facing, those components are going to be the CAPD nudges or the CDI engaged nudges showing for the specificity. If you are brand new to voice recognition and you are implementing Fluency Direct as part of this sort of contract execution, that would be a phase that we would look to begin with. And then we can really start showing those, as I mentioned, sort of the single document nudges to the providers here pretty quick. Once Fluency Direct is deployed, whether speech is in play or not, the nudges can happen shortly thereafter. And then depending on your expectations from a query perspective, we can get that stood up pretty fast as well. Now, I will tell you from a query delivery perspective, there are some customers that you have a very successful query delivery mechanism going on right now. You don't want to touch that as part of the implementation. You're interested in the nudges, you're interested in the CDI impact, but you really need to sort of take a step back from the query delivery perspective, and you need time to sort of cultivate that with your physician leadership, or you just need to digest how that's going to have an impact on your overall organization. That is completely fine. There are about 6 different configuration options that we have available with CDI Engage 1. And that doesn't mean that all are going to go live big bang, and that doesn't mean that all of them need to go live during your single implementation. We can definitely space them out to meet your needs and expectation. The rollout strategy for CDI Engage, for the physician facing in phase 1 is very fluid. Every customer does it a little bit differently. We do have a part of the technology that we refer to as silent mode, and that's in the background where we can capture documentation opportunities for our customers that say, hey, this is how many times you would have displayed a nudge to your provider for, let's say, the etiology of valvular stenosis. Well, what we have found through our implementations is that's only a very small piece of the puzzle. And so what we are really urging our customers to do is, while yes, we have silent mode available and we can capture that data for you, we really want to look at the data metrics that you have available today. What are your top queries? What are your top conditions that are going out on claims still underspecified? Have you had any recent RAC audits with monetary takebacks? Maybe that's an initiative that's going on. Has your CDI program sort of evolved and now they're taking on quality initiatives? So let's focus on those conditions. So while yes, we have the ability for silent mode on the vendor end to set for you, I really like to drive our customers to use your data metrics that you're already measuring against to help determine what those conditions are going to be that we would look to enable. And then we want to determine who are going to be those providers. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the goal of every customer that I work with is they want to see every provider see some type of nudge, but maybe it makes sense that we don't nudge certain specialties of providers because it's just going to create noise for them, or they're not a real focus area of the health system or the CDI program. I would say the rollout strategy can be as fast or as slow as the customer wants. I will say that a lot of times we do start off with certain specialties. We do not do big bang approach. For maybe a smaller community hospital that only has a couple hundred physicians, we might do big bang, but for the majority of the time, we're starting off with certain service lines, and then we're also starting off with certain providers of those service lines, and then we're trickling in additional providers over time till we get to sort of the end result. So that's really about phase 1. Phase 2 is really where we're going to start to get into the CDI impact. And here we're going to enable those evidence sheets. So that's going to be taking, again, taking away that manual aspect of needing to either jot notes down or going into the electronic medical record and reviewing multiple notes over days to see where the condition has been found, using that evidence sheet to sort of prioritize that. The prioritization work list, so where we're weighting at this point, we're assigning weights to clinical conditions to help sort of drive the priority and the focus of the CDI end user. We would also at this point introduce encounter-based nudges. So in phase 1, I said single document nudges, and that's where the provider is going to be nudged on the single document that they're working on at that time. Well, as part of this implementation, we will get to encounter-based nudges, and we'll then be looking at the documentation from the provider across the full encounter. We also have the ability to take in discrete laboratory data across an HL7 interface, as well as radiology results. So once we get to encounter-based nudges, it will be taking into consideration all 3 pieces of those data sources. And then 2, in phase 2, enhancing that query workflow integration in your CDI workflow if that is a desire. We like to, from a CDI perspective, roll out the different pieces of the different components of the functionality as close as possible. Yes, we have done broken up or completed broken up implementations of evidence sheets and then come back and introduce queries. But we like to do it all at once because then you're seeing one holistic workflow and we're only changing / touching your CDI workflow at one point rather than having to come back to multiple times. But if we have to do that, that is completely fine. We're able to do that and we have done that. Then in phase 3, and at this point of the implementation, a lot of times the implementation will be closed and you'll be in our adoption phase, but that's the tuning and optimization. So what we're doing here is we're continuously reviewing the NLU feedback. Where do we need to make tweaks to the NLU, or what parameters do we need to adjust? The nudges being displayed to your providers, that is not a like knee-jerk reaction type of technology. When we make changes, we want to let it go for a period of time so we can trend it. My recommendation is not to make changes more than once a quarter. There are some customers that I say, hey, depending on if you're, I'm here in Pittsburgh and I see all 4 seasons. Well, maybe I'm not seeing a lot of pneumonia right now because it's not dumping buckets of snow, but here come the fall and winter, we will see more pneumonia. Well, that's an enabled nudge. I don't want to shut it off for the summer because it may be a little bit more applicable as it comes time in the winter. So looking at really the nudge frequency and also your patient populations is when we're going to make changes, but we don't want to make changes more than probably once a quarter. And then following up on those conditions that have been enabled for the evidence sheets and prioritization to make sure that those are being fully optimized. And the same thing with not wanting to change nudges once a quarter. We don't want to be changing items for the conditions for the CDI team very frequently as either. We want to let that trend out. I would say from an optimization strategy, what we have seen is if you're able to get that department champion or that physician champion, that is a great benefit. And then we want to use your data from the use of the application to help drive the improvement and changes that we will see. And then there'll always be ongoing education and training, not only for providers, but the CDI end user. So examples of customization and tuning, I sort of touched on a little bit, but from a customization perspective, our natural language understanding is 100% customizable. Very rarely am I going to come back to you and say, hey, we're not able to do that request, or we're not going to be able to meet that customization that you're requesting. We're able to customize what the NLU is looking for in the way of the provider documentation, as well as we're also able to customize the nudge verbiage that is being displayed to your provider. So you may recall I mentioned that we can't diagnose for your providers. So we can customize the text on the nudge card in a way that we're not diagnosing for them, but we hear from providers a lot, I want to add this specificity in, but I just don't know what you're looking for. For example, I had a conversation this morning with a group of pediatricians, and one piece of feedback that they gave to me was, we were looking to enable nudges for type of acuity. And to them, well, to me, acuity is very straightforward, chronic, acute, acute on chronic. And they said, well, can we get that sort of helpful hint on the nudge card that that's what you're looking for as it relates to acuity? So we can definitely customize the verbiage on the message cards. So whether it be what's on the back end or what's being displayed to your end user, it's 100% customizable. It just is going to be dependent on how fast we can turn it around. When we start to customize the NLU, that is going to take a little bit of time. That has to go through a development life cycle, and that could take anywhere for about 2 months, depending on where the request comes in our development cycle. The physician nudge verbiage, that can be turned around pretty much same business day, as long as we're not changing the verbiage in a way that it would impact the back-end reasoning. And then the tuning. As you may recall, I said we're going to constantly have to tweak the NLU. It's not a perfect science. So in the tuning phase, we're ensuring that we are marking up that documentation appropriately. We're making sure that if you're using an abbreviation or your providers are using an abbreviation or acronym, that we are associating that correctly. We have found that customers, are using abbreviations to mean different things. Well, we can tweak the NLU to capture that. Punctuation is a very large piece of appropriate sort of markup, especially when we start to look in lab results. We want to make sure that those commas in lab results are being captured appropriately, as well as punctuation in your physician or provider documentation, that it is being captured accordingly. And then we want to make sure the underpinning clinical concept is being captured as well. We know that every provider documents something a little bit differently, and to the human, we're able to read and understand it, but from the computer end, we have to tweak the computer so that it understands that a little bit better. So the best practice from the physician or the provider engagement end is obviously we want to have a physician champion. I can't keep hitting that home enough, involved at the very beginning. We want to make sure that the clinical parameters that we're using matches your CDI practice or your health system practice. I know when working with physicians, sometimes what physicians want to provide for clinical parameters or expectation is a little bit different than what the CDI expects. So we might have to come to a level of an agreement that says, okay, this is what we're looking for. If you're not an organization that has standard sort of clinical parameters or practices in place for certain clinical conditions, we'll work with you to sort of come to that happy medium to make sure that it meets not only the clinician standpoint, but also the CDI practice. Continuing the tuning phase of sort of the nudge and understanding what may be captured in the background, and then using data, whether it be the silent mode that I discussed or your own internal data metrics, to help determine what are going to be those conditions that we're going to look to enable and when they will be enabled in the rollout strategy. The one piece that I would like to touch on is just the number of nudges that we're looking to enable. This technology is actually less is better. We do not want to cause alert fatigue like I previously mentioned. Our library for both CDI evidence sheets as well as nudges is probably sitting somewhere around 400 different clinical conditions. We will never enable all 400. Obviously, you're the customer and you can determine how many you want to enable, but I will always give pushback and I will always give my opinions. My recommendation is about a half a dozen to a dozen to start, because we want to not cause that alert fatigue and we want the providers to learn from the use of the technology. We found that if we start to get up into the dozens, we've lost them. But if we can stay at about a half a dozen to a dozen nudges, we have found that that's going to bring better value. They're going to get about 1 to 2 nudges on a piece of documentation, as well as in their physician sort of pane of sight with the Fluency Direct control bar, they're not going to have to scroll to see everything that is being displayed to them. If they're getting 1 to 2 nudges, it's all going to be visible to them right then and there, and they're going to be able to react and add that specificity that's required. Some of the technology considerations, as I previously mentioned, from a CDI Engage 1 perspective, Fluency Direct is the application that's required. That does not mean that front-end speech is needed. It sits on top of your electronic medical record. We are not fully integrated into the actual workflow. We sit on top of the electronic medical record. The nudges will appear in line to the provider as part of sort of their natural workflow. And then from the back-end CDI integration, as I mentioned, we are looking at the structured data and unstructured narrative notes. This can be part of 360 Encompass as well as a modal CDI Collaborate. We also will be looking at the structured data, the discrete data as it relates to the labs in the radiology results. And the discrete lab data is a very large win, especially for CDI teams, because we're not looking at the lab results that are only contained within the provider documentation. Obviously, we are reviewing that and capturing that, but having the discrete lab data is very important. We can find from the HL7 interface that a patient was hypokalemic and that their potassium level was 2.5, but a provider never identified that in their documentation, so we can nudge them. So we can use the discrete lab data to also help drive some of those encounter-based nudges. Now, in this slide, we are talking about how we use the data to drive improvement. And I'm not going to really go through the definitions one by one here, but really these are the data metrics that we are capturing. the number of active providers. So this is the providers that really have used the technology or been exposed to the technology during the reporting period. The number of configured nudges that we have available for your providers. How many of those nudges actually fired to your provider? What did your provider do to the nudge? Did they add the specificity in? Did they ignore it? Or they also have the ability to dismiss it and make it go off their screen. This is not a hard stop technology, so just because a nudge was displayed to the provider doesn't mean they have to add that specificity before signing their note, moving on within their workflow. But the benefit is if they do ignore a nudge, that's where the CDI team, both in 360 and Compass and CDI Collaborate, is going to be able to see that that has been ignored and then determine if a CDI query needs to be sent. We're going to tell you your message resolution rate. So of those messages or those nudges that displayed to your provider, what is the percent that they added that specificity in? And as I previously mentioned, we want to also capture where they are doing good and they're compliantly adding the specificity in through their workflow. At the end of the day, whether it's through the use of the technology or their natural documentation habits, we want to see where those compliant messages actually fall. The hope is that your compliance rate is very high and the percentage of opportunities is very low. And then we would expect that percentage of opportunities to then turn into CDI queries that have been sent to your providers. So at this point, I will turn it back over to Lisa.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. We really appreciate all that information. And for anybody that does have these solutions implemented within their facilities, I'm sure it was extremely helpful. And so with that, we are going to get to some questions, but I am going to launch a quick poll that if you would like somebody to contact you for more information, we can certainly do that. So again, if you are interested, please complete this poll. But going into the questions, like I said, we do have a few and we'll get to as many as we can. From Terrence asked, is there a known error rate of the clinical condition nudges?
So as we're looking at the error rate, I would say I don't have anything off the top of my head to tell you from an NLU perspective that, you know, this has been marked up incorrectly this percent of the time. It's part of the implementation, and I did not go into great detail as this phase, but I mentioned, you know, on average it's a 24-month implementation because for about 90 days of that implementation process, we are going through an NLU review of your documents, both a technology review as well as a clinical review, because we want to capture those errors prior to them going out to your provider. So we are looking at a corpus of your documents to say, okay, this is what we found as errors, and these are tweaks that need to be made to the NLU prior to going live with the implementation. So I don't have anything readily available that says across this clinical condition we find this percent of error, but we do, with a fine-tooth comb, review your documents so that we can capture those errors prior to going live.
Okay, and there's actually a follow-up, same person. Once the nudge is activated, what is the ask of the provider? Just to agree, or is there subsequent info that they will then need to add?
So from the provider's perspective, what we are looking for them to do is to take the physical action to add that specificity into their documentation. So if we, you know, for example, I know I go back to it a lot for heart failure, the nudge it's going to display to them is going to ask for the type and acuity of heart failure. So we would look for the provider to take the physical action to add that specificity back into their documentation, whether it be through the voice recognition, if they need to update their problem list and repopulate their problem list, or they could easily just go in and type the specificity behind that. So it's the provider taking the physical action themselves to add that specificity.
Great. Next one that we have, does 3M have an HCC program built into the CDI program?
Oh, you broke up there, Lisa. What was the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. Can you hear me better now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. Does 3M have an HCC program built into the CDI program?
So we do have an HCC management platform. It is outside of the CDI Engage One suite that I just spoke of. but we do have HCC management available. It is similar concepts in the sense of notifications displaying to the provider real time in their workflow, and then we have a back-end CDI platform that is also available if you have an outpatient CDI program in place.
Okay, great. Another question from Katie. If you have multiple facilities, can you roll them out separately and with different nudges?
You can. So that is a good question. And what we would do is we would identify that in the very beginning of your implementation as to how we want to identify your facilities. Some customers that have multiple facilities, cardiology is cardiology across the health system, and they're going to see these same nudges. But then you could have the ability to say, okay, cardiology at hospital A is going to see these nudges, and cardiology at hospital B is going to see these nudges. So they can be based off of the enterprise, and every facility sees the same nudges, or we could base them off a facility. And it's all going to be about how we set up your deployment and then getting that information back to you as to where we sort of need to house the provider. I will tell you where we sometimes run into issues is the providers that go between facilities is where we sometimes run into struggle, because we need a home facility to sort of identify that provider and to enable certain nudges. But there are multiple different configuration options that we would talk through during the discovery process as to how you would want to enable the nudges and for what facility or for what provider in your overall expectation.
Okay, great. Next one from Doug. What does it mean when a row in the output shows that it was resolved, but also a tick that was naturally compliant? Why does it look like both?
So it could be that from and I would need to maybe know an example, a better example to sort of look at it a little bit closer. But if it would be that if they had a resolved nudge, it shouldn't necessarily be documented as naturally compliant, but they could have a resolved nudge and a compliant nudge because our compliant messages are looking at both what the technology is driven is also as well as their natural documentation habit.
Okay, we have one from Jean. What was the biggest challenge that your clients have experienced after their go live?
I would say one of the biggest challenges that we always face, and it's an uphill battle, is just getting the provider buy-in. For the technology not being a hard stop, that's sort of a great win from the provider end because they can still sign their notes and move on within their workflow. But getting physician and provider engagement is normally the struggle. I will tell you that the hospitalists are normally the first ones to come on board because they are the ones that own the medical record. They're also the ones that are sometimes a little bit more in tune with the overall sort of impact to, let's say, what maybe is getting reported to U.S. News and World Report. And so they're a little bit more honed into the overarching impact. Some of the subspecialties are where we really have challenges. And for those that are from CDI on the call, I'm sure when I say surgeons are the number one sort of pushback, it's going to be no surprise to you. But as we get into some of the, I will say, those that are very difficult from a CDI perspective, because I don't know the physicians that are on the phone, that's the uphill battle. But getting physician engagement and buy-in, the sooner that we can cultivate this, get physician leadership on board, it does make for a successful implementation. If we are only going to the providers a month before go live, that is where the struggles come.
Okay, a question from Christine. Does 3M have a physician query tracker?
So we may need to follow up to that question, but from a physician query delivery perspective, as part of this implementation, whether you would be using 360 Encompass or CDI Collaborate, we would be able to keep your basically your query delivery process all contained within your CDI workflow. So we would track all your queries in your impact through either application. You don't necessarily need to do any tracking within your electronic medical record. So we would track all queries sent, resolved, and reconciliation and impact within the CDI platforms.
Okay, and another one from Katie was, is the nudge based on the type of provider or diagnostic findings / documentation?
So the nudges are always going to go back to how we have associated that provider to a group. So as we go through the implementation, we will identify the groups, and as I mentioned, like sort of that home facility in the last example, we will put every provider profile into different groups or buckets. So depending on what we have enabled for that group depends on the nudge that's going to display to the provider, not necessarily the patient type. So for example, let's say, this may be a bad example, but I think it'll get my point across. Let's say for the group, we have enabled both respiratory failure and abdominal pain, and the patient is, the provider is documenting, the patient that the provider is documenting on is heart failure, but they also start talking about some type of abdominal pain. We will fire the abdominal pain to that provider because that's enabled for that group, even though the underpinning diagnosis may be, or the focus may be around heart failure. It's all going to go back to the nudge that's enabled for the provider, not necessarily the patient sort of type or maybe underlying diagnosis.
Okay, and I'm going to ask one more question. Do the same conditions need to be enabled for both nudges and evidence sheets?
That is a very good question, and they do not. The only caveat to that is if you want your CDI team to see the nudge activity in their workflow, they do have to be enabled one for one. What we have found, though, is, as I mentioned from the nudge perspective, what we want to enable to providers is about 6 to 12. From a CDI standpoint, we found that there's a little bit more tolerance there. So maybe we might look to enable, let's say, 10 to 16. So there might not be a one-to-one correlation, but I will tell you for the majority of our customers, so that the CDI team can see that nudge activity and tell if a provider truly ignored the nudge, they are for a one-for-one matching, but they do not need to be.
Okay, fantastic. And again, thank you so much for all the information that you did provide today. Just as a reminder, we are recording this session, so you will be receiving an email in the next week or so with the archive if you would like to re-listen. We will be sending out a certificate of attendance right after the webinar, but also right after the webinar, once we close, we'd really appreciate for you to complete that survey just so we know how we did. And if you have any questions or comments, you can add there as well. So again, we really appreciate all the information today. Josh, is there anything closing that you would like to say?
Nope, just thank you everyone for your time today.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and everybody have a good rest of the week. Thanks so much.